and maybe the stuff that is talked about on Facebook, where we use terms like up and so on, will help you understand what we're talking about. So I'm going to start, because hopefully anyone that's here is here. If I can push the right button. We're going to start with that. So this could be growing instructions that you'd be given as you give a dahlia. So if I give one to Ian and say, here's a plant, it's a new variety, grow it like this. So it'd be a small semi, best grown undercover with a good base dressing and plenty of liquid and foliar feeds. Put the pot tuber on heat in January, take the cutting end of March, pot into a 5-inch and plant deep. Double stop at the end of June, grow 8 up, stripping down from 12 up. Knock any early buds back into early August, take the bud on a wing and 3 pairs down, leave a bit of rough, cut 36 hours before staging with plenty in the middle. It can throw the odd clock face bloom and will drop its back when the centre gets weak. Now, if you understand all of that, then you probably shouldn't be here, including Ian. But they're the sort of terms that, to me, that would make sense. But probably if someone handed me a plant and said, do all that to it, I'd probably say it's not worth the effort, and pick a different variety. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of the presentation, this growing instructions may make some sense as to what we mean by it. The word classifications, terrible, frightening, and generally the majority of this is not necessarily needed if you're growing just for the pleasure in the garden. The classified directory is just really the reference point to see whether they're classified or not, and as what. The only benefit of knowing the classifications is if you've got a particular variety in your garden and you like the shape of the flower and what it is, and you want to get more of them, if you can understand that that might be a miniature ball, when you're looking for other varieties that are similar, you can look for miniature balls. Classified and unclassified, there isn't really a lot of difference in that, other than it's in the book or it's not in the book. Every flower should still be able to put in its pocket, be it under its classification, whether it's in the book or not. But only knowing what the guidelines are would help you with that. Show variety and garden variety, I'll probably put it the other way around, but really every variety to me is a garden variety. It's just whether it conforms to the show standards. And there's no reason why any of the show varieties we use wouldn't perform in the garden. And I always say, if you've got a variety that has got weak stems, fades in the sun, blows its centres, isn't that useful in that sense, then it wouldn't make a good show variety or a garden variety. We don't want things in our show beds that might have inherent faults. Seedlings, seed raised. It's confusing, and we often see that people refer to something as a seedling and it hasn't necessarily come from seed in that year. So really a seedling is a variety that isn't out there, it isn't in general commerce, it hasn't been classified, it's not on release, and is effectively on trial. So it would have originally been raised from a seed, but has been maintained through green cuttings or from the tuber in following years. It will always be called a seedling up until the raiser decides to give it a name and put it out onto the market. Seed raised might be if you get a packet of Bishop's Children or dwarf bedding, sow the seeds and flower them. They're seed raised. And if you take seeds from those and sow them again, they'll still be seed raised because they're not really a variety, won't have a name unless you propagate it in the second year and keep the same variety going again. Now I'll flash over the classifications, but the web link at the bottom there is the one to the classified section on the Dahlia Society website, and you can have a look at that to get yourself some more information. It would probably be an evening in itself to go through the detail in all of these groups. And it was pointed out to me that actually there's one missing from these groups, and that's Stella. But these are all the groups that are there, and most dahlias will fit into any one of them. And if they don't fit into any of those, then they end up in the miscellaneous bit. One note for most people is that dinner plate isn't a classification. I think it gets used far too much, and as someone that's trying to grow giant and large decks at the moment, it makes me shrink a bit. If my flowers were the size of a dinner plate but only the depth of one, then we'd be in trouble. So dinner plates generally are referring to decorative dahlias in the large and giant classifications or sizes. One thing to remember, that in all these classifications, or most of them, under semi-cactus, decorative, then you've also got the size groups being miniature, small, medium, large and giant. Things like collarettes, water lilies, and some of those groups don't have size to them, but others do. But dinner plate isn't a classification. If you go off to your show with a large flower and look for a dinner plate class to put it in, you might struggle. So we're going to start this really from the bottom up. And I know we've probably got people from different parts of the country and the world, hopefully, and we'll all call these different things, but the tuber clump, in England, UK, we just call it a tuber. That's what we expect. If we order a tuber, we'd expect something that looked like that. If you do that in America and Canada, and you order a tuber, you get something completely different that we tend to call a chicken leg. We'll show you those. So down from there, we've got the stem, the crown, which is really where the fingers of the tuber, the potato parts of the tuber meet the stem, the tuber itself, the finger part, the root, and the eye. Luckily, that one's got an eye on it, so we can see where it is. And that's where our cuttings and the shoots will come from. And it's the part where the fingers join the stem and around the crown. Field tubers. In this top picture here, we've got the field tuber, and in the tray are pot tubers. And they're only really plants that are grown in pots to restrict its growth. It means we get a smaller stem, a nice sort of clumpy tuber, and it tends to help when varieties don't produce tubers particularly easily. They store well, they start easily, and if you're trying to fit a few in a tray, you can fit plenty in there. So there's the pot tuber on my hand, and that would have been grown in a 3-inch pot. And then chicken legs, which is really how it seems to be most people other than us tend to do it. Cuttings. Node joint, it moves. So the node is really where the leaves are joining the stem. This would have been a node before it grown any roots. Strike and take, I think, are probably just two terms of the same thing. You strike a cutting. I tend to think if I'm taking a cutting, I'm cutting it from the tuber. If I'm striking it, it's the process of trying to get it to grow roots. And that's how I see the difference, but generally they're the same term. The root plate is the bit that's forming at the base where we cut below a node, and that's where the roots are going to come from. If you pull a cutting out of the compost early, you'll quite often see it sort of scar over and forming the plate before the roots come out of it. Mother plant, it's not just a big plant. It's a plant that we're expecting to cut other cuttings from. So this cutting will grow on, it'll grow extra pairs of leaves, and you might take the very top. Now we know what take means, I can use a word. Take the very top as a cutting, leaving pairs of leaves below that will produce shoots, and then you can take cuttings from those. So it's just really an early cutting that we're going to take further cuttings from. Quite often you can then use those as pot tuber plants later on. Bottom heat, that's not keeping your rear end warm. That is just purely heat to the bottom of the tray, and is normally from heat mats, soil warming cables, and I remember my dad used to put a paraffin heater under a bench and put a cover down it, and that was bottom heat. It's just a way of making the tubers think that it's not that time of year really, and they're going to start throwing some shoots. Blackleg, not the name of a pirate, but is the name that we tend to use quite a bit. And it's just generally when the cutting rots at the base of the plant, it goes jet back, rots, and almost falls over. There's various reasons to it. It's normally not enough light, too much humidity, and possibly too much heat. And only getting the balance of those things correct will reduce the amount of blackleg that you get. The later in the season it is, the longer the day lengths are, the less it seems to be a problem, and it's there. But you'll often see people refer to, I'm suffering with blackleg, and it's nothing wrong with their legs, it's just their cuttings rotting. The ground and feeding, base dressing, top dressing, liquid feed, and foliar feed. Well, they're all going to do a similar job, but a base dressing is something that we're normally going to put into the ground before the plants go into the ground. So it's a priory dressing, and it would be bone meal, bloodfish and bone, any generally slow release fertilizer, lime, and you're just adding some longer lasting nutrients into the whole ground as a general area before you're planting your plants. Top dressing, well, gives it away a bit top. So that might be an application of chicken pellets or something like that to the top of the ground that as it rains or you water will work into the ground and add additional feeds to the plant. They're normally shorter lived feeds, so feeds that will dissolve and work over a shorter period of time than something like bone meal that will last probably about 8 weeks, where a top dressing like chicken pellets is probably 4 to 6 weeks. Liquid feed is anything that you're going to add to the plant in the form of a liquid, something that's soluble. It's normally the Miracle Grows or beer, but Miracle Grows, and you'll change that throughout the year, being it a nitrogen balanced or a potash feed throughout the year, but it's extra things. I tend to see base dressing as roast dinners and liquid feeds as burgers and Red Bulls, really. It's short-lived, quick acting, and gives them a boost. Foliar feed, much the same. So quite often you'd use something like a seaweed liquid, Maxi Crop for us, but seaweed or comfrey or any of those, and you're making a solution and you're spraying it as a mist or through a watering can, and you're purposely putting it onto the leaves of the dahlia. And some would say that plants will take the feed in quicker through the leaves than they would the roots and other means. So it's sort of different ways of doing the same thing, and you'd use different things for different purposes throughout the growing season. And quite often liquid and foliar feeds can also be corrective feeds if we've seen that there's issues with plants and we need to add another element. Stops, stops and double stops. Well, there's not a lot of difference between them, but they often get confused. And generally people seem to do it too many times. Like if you say to remove the growing tip out of plants to produce more flowers, you find out that they're still doing it in August, and it's not going to help them very much. So this is generally a practice that is done earlier in the season, probably into July at the latest for us over here. And this would be a stop. We're just removing the growing tip from the plant, and it's normally done with finger and thumb, and is easily done. A chop really is the same thing on a larger plant using a knife. You're removing more of the plant, and I will call it a chop. Others probably just call it stopping, but if you hear someone say I've chopped it back, it's the same as a stop, just heavier done. And then the double stop, you'll see that the plant on the right there has already been stopped, the growing tip's already been removed, and we've got some laterals, and we'll use that term a lot going through, but laterals coming from the stems, and then those will be stopped again, so the growing tip will be removed again to produce more shoots. Basically, you're only likely to do a double stop if you require more shoots than you're going to get from stopping it once, removing the growing tip once, or as a method to delay flowering, delay the time that the plant's going to flower. But those we'll cover in the other talks. Ups, laterals and straight up. Straight up's a Sutherland term, and you'll find him using that more than most. He's fortunate up in the north of the country, you could probably just do this towards the end of June, and we've removed the growing tip from the plant, and the side shoots, the laterals are forming, and that plant would have 6 or so laterals. And those 6 or so laterals, if we want 6 flowers on this plant, we'd remove all the extra ones to leave us 6, and that's up. We're going to flower this plant with 6 stems that will produce 6 flowers, no more, no less. We're controlling it. Straight up will be doing that with the confidence that those shoots that you see there will go up and flower without any intervention along the way, knockbacks and tweaks and chopping them back again or a double stop. So you're growing straight from the original shoots produced from the main stem to flower. Flower goes in the vase. I would say that's straight up. Lovely to be able to do that in the south, but unfortunately we struggle, so most things ended up getting double stops. Stripping down to numbers. I don't mean you go out in your pants and start playing with your dahlias. It's stripping down the shoots, and generally you're going to remove the weakest shoots or even the strongest shoots. Stripping down is a process where you're trying to have a balanced plant, leaving it with the number of shoots that you intend to flower. You can do it early, like this shows. This would be a very early stage of stripping down, but you might do that, and as the instructions showed, strip down to 12 and then 8 later. So you might just remove some of it, take it to a higher number. I used to always leave an extra one for the football or the cat or the dog. If he knocks it off, it's not going to cause any problems. And then just adjust later. You'll often find plants will produce extra shoots, and you need to go through the plants, just counting and removing any extra ones. Say you're going to take the strongest shoots out, it's worth doing, because if you've got 1 or 2 very strong shoots, strength always goes to strength, and those will be strong and probably produce 2 bigger flowers, and the rest of the plant won't get enough nutrients. So I tend to take the weakest and the strongest to strip down to the numbers we want to flower. You see the top picture there is what would have come out of that plant to get to that. Well, there's the stem. We're back to the lateral again. And the lateral now's grown, and it's gained a bud. This is actually a pom stem. I think it's Willow's Violet actually, but so terminal bud is the one at the very top. It's the one in the middle, and that lateral will produce a terminal bud. Either side of that bud, you'll find one that is slightly bigger than the other. Normally, from memory, the left one's bigger than the right, and they're the wing buds. So when we say we're going to flower it on a wing, we're actually going to remove the terminal bud and pick one of these side buds to flower for us. Then you would remove all the side shoots going down the stem. So going down 2 pairs, we're going to go down, for me, this is the first pair, not this pair. That's the growing tip. First pair, second pair. You remove the growing shoots out the side, not the leaves. I've seen it done where people cut the leaves off as well, but the shoots for 2 pairs down. If you're going to grow it later, and I will briefly cover a knockback, then you'll be going, I'm pointing at the screen rather than using that, flowering one of these shoots as being your flowering shoot. So going from the top, terminal bud, bracts or calyx. If you're growing poms and you hear people talk about removing the calyxes to help the flower come back to the stem, then we're talking about these. They're removed normally finger and thumb to enable the flower to come back to the stem, because they're generally too large, and that becomes a fault. If you're not showing them, it don't matter, just leave them there. It's just another job to do. So again, first pair, second pair, but this is still the lateral. It's just grown. It's just a bit taller. Briefly, knocking back. You'll hear it used a lot. I'm not going to go into the detail of how, what, where, and when, but it's a way of timing, and it's a method that is used later in the season. So if you think the plants are getting away and growing and going to flower too early for a specific date, you'd perhaps do a double stop early on to restart the plant again. Once you get beyond the point, you're really going to do fine tuning, and that's all knocking back is fine tuning. This would be 20 to 25 days would be the smaller sections, not the giants, and this will vary what part of the country or world you're in to how long that will take. We use the term Pea Bud. The bud you're seeing there is probably a little bit in advance of the Pea Bud. So when the bud is completely covered, you're not seeing this bit in the middle there. That would be a Pea Bud, and most people work from that date onwards. So if you're going to delay this shoot here should have a bud in it a week later than this bit, and so on. I'm not going to go into it any more than that, but it's a method we use, and you'll hear it used a lot. I'll just knock it back a bit, or just do that. It's a bit more technical than what we're going to cover tonight, but that's what we're meaning. It's not chopping the plant down to the ground. It's not applying a second stop. You are restricting that lateral to one flowering shoot for later. Now, this could be debatable. Coarse and refined. Coarse, really, that is this flower. To me, that is a coarse flower. It's not got enough petal in it. The reason being, it's still young. When you look at the flower and you see a lot of petals in the centre there, that's just a young flower. But you put that in front of a judge, he'll say it was coarse and it's got a big centre. Refined for the similar size category, so this is a small decorative, I would say that bloom is suitably refined. It's got enough petals, enough rows of petals, and really the rows as you count down there's a lot. Here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we're at the back of the bloom. So that would be refined. I would also say that was, if you saw it from above, possibly a proportionate centre. But coarse refined, when we say something is coarse, that's what we mean. It's not that it's nasty, it's just perhaps a bit young. There's some beauties. Green centre. Now, some people find this attractive, and if you do, good luck to you. That's what dahlias are about. There's something and everything for everyone, but the green centre is just undeveloped. It's a centre that hasn't yet turned these green bit parts into petals and is leaving a green dot in the middle, and that can be a dot or it could be the size of a button. It's still a green centre. In judging terms, that's a fault. In the garden, who cares? If you don't like the look of it, enjoy it. Most of dahlias that produce have a green centre. If you leave them on the plant long enough, it will go and it will become a normal centre. It's just, again, age and development. Well, this flower here has got all of them. Weak, oval and mouth organ. Weak centre isn't something that's not going to hold up a bus. It's just not got very many petals left in it, and it's usually not exposing itself. It's not showing a hole in the centre, but there might only be 4 or 5 petals touching to form that middle. This one is also oval, and it's also got a nice mouth organ bit. And that's what we mean. The line across the centre of the bloom is mouth organ. It's also, the flower's not got much else going for it, but generally we concentrate so much on centres because the flower has to come from the centre. So if the centre's not round or it's got problems, quite likely the flower won't be round and will have problems. So it's a good sign to see what you're expecting to see as you look further into the bloom. Heavy centre. To me, that's a heavy centre. It's not got a green dot in it. It's not there. It's just heavy. It's not proportionate to the bloom. But probably if you're cutting flowers for the vase indoors and you want them on the sideboard, cutting them at that sort of stage is probably the ideal because they will carry on developing in water and you'll get some good life out of them indoors. But from our point of view, if we say its centre's still a bit heavy, that means it's not that it weighs a lot, there's just a lot of petal in there. Blown or daisy-eyed, well, quite often when something is blown, it is also daisy-eyed because purely the petals in the centre that are forming a defined middle have opened up and the flower's effectively not going to develop anymore. And it shows the pollen-bearing bits in the middle there, which looks much like a daisy when they're fully open. That flower will still do fine in the garden for a couple of days, but if you're cutting it to last long indoors, it won't. And I think in our talk, which in the descriptions, I said about dropping its back when the centre is light or weak. That is just purely as the bloom gets old, it is likely to shatter, to start dropping petals and lose its freshness at the back. I haven't got a picture of a bloom dropping its back. We can probably guess this variety. It's well known and people love it in the garden and around, and it's probably cafe au lait. But when we say that the bloom is clock-faced, that's it. Those are clock-faced. You can tell the time off it, the angle, this being the face of the bloom here, and the stem going in is not ideal. Not ideal for showing, if you like it, and it's probably quite good in the vase because it's definitely going to be looking at you. The ideal for us is this, 45 degrees, and no more than, much more than that. So if it becomes closer to the stem, then it's going to be getting towards clock faced. And if the bloom sits that way, so the centre is looking directly upwards, we'd class that as a top sitter. Probably in reality, top sitters are less frowned upon than slightly over angled. And for us in the show world, we just want them all to be the same. And it probably doesn't really matter if it's anywhere in between ideal and top sitter, as long as they're all the same angle, with the exception of things like collarettes, where the angle is more important. Undercover. Well, that's not Secret Service. It is purely flowering the flowers under a cover. That could be a polythene, a tarpaulin, it could be a shade net. And we're not generally, some people will grow them in undercover or in tunnels all year, but mostly the cover goes up at the point of flowering or just before flowering. What cover does and why you'd stipulate to someone grow it undercover is probably a few things. One, it will protect the flower when it's certainly getting old. We tend to show fairly old blooms, mature blooms when we're showing them, and at which point the petals towards the back are probably the oldest and they will be more prone to damage from wind, rain, mists, and just general dampness. So the cover will help restrict that or prevent that. The other thing it does do is it seems to help quill or refine the petals. So it will make a semi-cactus slightly more refined than what it would do growing outside. And it will also make the plant flower slightly taller. So if it's a short variety, grown under cover will help it be taller. And yes, Ian, that is my plot with Kiwi Gloria in it. And you'll notice all the soggy backs and the green centres probably from there. But covers of that, it's not needed outside. When we talk about varieties and garden varieties, probably growing giants and large outside will mean that you may get a damaged bloom when it comes to cutting it for indoors. The mediums, smalls, miniatures, and that are much more suited just to growing unprotected outside generally. Staging. It's not an act or a performance, we're just purely putting the flowers in the vase and trying to make them, I suppose, look the best they can for the judge. They go on to staging. We stage the vase, we stage the bloom, and we put them on staging. So everything to do with stage seems to be to do with putting your exhibit on the bench. And that's all we're trying to do. It's putting them in the vase in a way that will ideally make them look most appealing, and also, if you're clever enough, you put them in the vase in the right order that you won't accentuate any faults, and you may be able to guide the judge elsewhere. 9 out of 10, thank you. So coming back to this, and I'm going to see if I can remove his 9 out of 10. Oh, it's done it for me. Coming back to this, hopefully some of this now might make a little bit more sense. So small semi, which would be a small semi cactus from the classification, best grown under cover. We've just done the cover with a good base dressing and plenty of liquid and foliar feeds. You wouldn't naturally feed small semis a lot, but this is instruction given. Put the pot tuber, so we know we've been given a small tuber that's been produced in a pot on heat in January, and that's just about waking it up early to get plenty of cuttings from it. Whether you do it in January, March, February, it doesn't really matter. As exhibitors, we tend to do it earlier. If you just want flowers for the garden, you would do it much later. Take the cutting, we know what that is. At the end of March, pot into 5-inch, plant deep. Didn't cover planting deep, it's just digging a bigger hole. And reasons for doing that will probably be covered in future talks. Double stop at the end of June. We know what a double stop is now, and that means that the second stop, the second time we remove the growing tips, will be at the end of June. Grow 8 up, stripping down late, and late would be just at point or just before the point those shoots are probably producing buds. That would be deemed as late for me. Anything before that would be normal. From 12 up, so we allowed 12 shoots to grow originally. Knock any early buds back until early August, and that's just a matter of timing that a bud in August might make it to a September show, rather than chopping the plant back too hard. Take on a wing bud. One reason I didn't highlight about why we would do that is if you grow a giant deck, one particularly called Mark Hardwick, that has a very short stalk. From the last pair of leaves to the flower is very short. It seems that if you allow one of the side buds, the wing buds, to flower, then that will extend that footstalk and make it a little bit more appropriate to the flower. It will also take a bit of vigour out of the bloom if it's a flower that produces perhaps too much petal, and it will help reduce that if it's needed. And rarely do you need to reduce petal in a flower, but that's a reason. Wing bud and 3 pairs down, so you're just going to take the side shoots away, 3 pairs down, and leaving a bit of rough, because you will get further growth growing from the lower part of the plant, where we'd normally go on our hands and knees taking that out. If you leave that there, it will help reduce again the vigour and perhaps add some refinement to the bloom. Some varieties benefit from it, some don't. I didn't really cover this. Cut 36 hours before staging. We know what staging is, putting it in the vase ready for the judge, with plenty in the middle. So traditionally, you'd probably cut the flowers the morning before the show, or the morning before they're going to get judged, so 24 hours. If they cut longer than that, they will continue to refine, to quill in water, as long as they're kept somewhere cool. And that may improve the formation of the flower, and it works for certain varieties. If you're going to cut it 36 hours before the judge is going to see it, you need to make sure that the middle, the centre of the bloom has enough development left in it to still be the right size when the judge walks in. So it's just about adjusting what you do, and the best way to do it is to cut flowers at different times, at different stages, take pictures and look at what the end result is, and you'll get used to different varieties. It can throw the odd clock face bloom, we know what that is, and we'll drop its back when the centre gets weak. So we saw weak centres and oval centres, and that's really at that stage. What you don't want is the judge to walk up and find a lot of petals on the bench where they fell out because the bloom's got too hard, and some varieties will be more prone to that than others. Just pushing this button. So we've got to the end. I'm going to try and see where chat is, and I'll come out of this share window, hopefully. And then we can see some pretty faces. Oh, I don't know about that one. So in chat, let's have a look. What have we got? Victoria's, when would you strip down to numbers? Well, I think I sort of in the end covered that. It's at the point that you feel confident that the shoots that you're going to leave are going to produce a flower when you want them to. It's probably only experience will teach you that. There is guideline timings, stages along the way that you might pick up on. I think 70 days for us is about the time it takes from the moment you remove the growing tip and those laterals to grow and produce a flower. But different parts, different varieties will vary that. But when you're doing it is at the time you feel confident enough that the ones that you are leaving are going to do the thing that you want them to. The branching, yes, is exactly the same as stripping down. You're removing the branches. It depends what you call them. If you call them a branch or a lateral or a shoot, they're all the same terms really for the same thing, and probably just used at different stages more than anything else. Who is the National Dahlia Society and where do you fit in? I don't fit in there anywhere at the moment, but the National Dahlia Society is purely the UK-based national society for the appreciation of the dahlia. It's a charity. The charitable aim is to promote the dahlia in all its forms and to encourage people to like them, love them, and do something with them. And although we're often seen, I say we, I feel part of it, I suppose, often seen as being exhibition-led, and that's really just the arm that you see because that's the bit that gets in the press, that appears on Facebook, that makes people go, oh, ow, wow. But I'd like to think that we all, whether we're exhibitors or not, just love the flower and want more people to grow more of it and enjoy them. It's just, giving a talk perhaps on growing for the garden would take about 10 minutes. Because really dahlias do it for you. You plant them, you water them, give them a half tidy, a bit of care, and they will perform. It's only the very fine detail that we end up going to show the blooms that perhaps makes it more interesting for those that have already know what they're doing with a dahlia. The talks we're going to do going forwards will be basic level originally first, which is next Wednesday, which I think we've already got over 74, and we've got a maximum of 100. So if you're not sent in your email, do so. And that'll be just growing them, the techniques, why we feed, what we feed in a basic level, plant support, propagation, and just trying to get a bit more out of them in the garden. The second one will be getting even more out of them, going into showing at perhaps local level and up to specialist, if you fancy a go at it. So we'll then talk a bit more about timing and methods we might use to encourage flowers to do what they do. And then the last one, I can't think of any other name for it, but it's nutter level, which is us nutters really, him included. And the detail and lengths and perhaps the growing of the numbers, getting the timing of the flushes and the numbers we need, the detail in which will make a difference perhaps on the bench, and make us nutters really, because it just takes hours and hours and a lot of work. I'm just scrolling up, it says. No, that's Vanessa, she started that one, so we go back down at the bottom. Thank you, Paul, for your kind remarks. Any other questions on there? What we'll probably do is we'll unmute you all so we can chat in general. If you want to disappear, you can disappear. If you want to ask a question, there's still quite a few of you there, so let's not try to have lots of people talking at the same time. But if you want to ask me or any of the other familiar faces that you see on your screen. Any questions you can.
You've gone quiet.
I've been muted because we've all unmuted you. So yeah, they're most. So certainly in our area, we've got Essex, Kent, Sussex, Surrey. The further least populated areas, they've probably got less societies, but there's one within reach, probably of most people throughout the country. Hertfordshire, Essex is probably your closest one. There is local societies in Hertfordshire, but Essex, there was a Cambridge, I think, at one point, but I don't think that's there. See you later, Jen. Thank you. I think there's a poll somewhere at the bottom if anyone can mark it, if they actually enjoyed it or not. It'll help going forwards. There it is. So if you've all got a poll, if you can mark that on there, then at least we know if we're doing something right. And so the next one will be more detail and more about the growing, but carry on asking questions if you've got one. We'll unmute you and you can go from there. Just going to hide the poll. I can't see anyone. Right. Let's see if I can do it. If not, Vanessa might be able to do it for me.
Hello.
You've got a hand up there. Derek wants to answer.
Thanks a lot. It's been really interesting on the Facebook page, which I joined last year, to see all the dialogue going on between you guys. And that talk has explained a lot about terms that I had no idea what you were talking about. But it does seem very fascinating. I'm at very early stages. I have ordered way too many tubers. I was expecting them to come like a chicken leg, but now you're telling me I'm getting clumps of tuber, and they haven't arrived yet. I don't know when they arrive. And
I think that what you get will depend on where you've got it from. So if you get it from a grower, you, like I and anyone else says, oh, I'll give you some tubers, you will probably get field tubers, the big ones. If you're ordering from like halls or trees, then you'll get something more like a pot tuber, which is probably better. If you're at this stage of growing, dealing with field tubers is probably not the best thing. Pot tubers is the easier route.
I was just expecting to shove it in the ground.
You can do that.
You know.
We will cover that. We will cover that next week. But you can do that. But I'd probably advise you not to. For the reason you grow dahlias, if you're growing them to flower early, to get flowers and long-lasting flowering, I would say you're better off just to wake it up before you plant it, and you're risking less chance of it rotting in the ground and starting. And the earlier you wake it up, as long as you've got some provision to maintain it out of frost, a flower, and that's it. Once these things start flowering, it's perpetual motion; they don't stop. So we'll hopefully cover that next week in a bit more detail, and hopefully you won't be quite so frightened when these horrible-looking arrive in the post.
Okay, thank you.
Derek's got his hand up.
See, Derek. So go on, Derek.
Are you aiming to record the next technical Facebook or the Zoom programs? Because I'm in the Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. I belong to the Croissant Society, and their Zoom meeting is next week as well.
Yes, we were sort of guided by mine and my co-host here, Vanessa's availability. So we're trying to squeeze it in next week because we're around, and then it'll be at least a couple of 3 weeks before the next one. We're going to try and record.